The Theater History podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com.
Hi, and welcome to the Theater History podcast. I'm Mike Leager. If you're listening to this show, there's a pretty good chance that you're a fan of Broadway musicals. But how much do we think about the ways in which societal attitudes towards things like gender shape those shows, or vice versa? Today we're joined by Dr. Stacy Wolf of Princeton University. As its subtitle indicates, her book, Changed for Good, A Feminist History of the Broadway Musical, offers us a different perspective on some familiar works. Stacy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
You write that, quote, gender inflects and shapes every aspect of the musical. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yes. Well, first, we live in a culture that is fundamentally organized and interpreted by gender. Gender, and I'd also say race and ethnicity, are the first characteristics that we tend to notice about people. And so that's what we notice about characters in musicals as characters in any form of representation. So gender shapes musicals the same way it does for any play or movie or television show. We see gender on a body and we make assumptions about that character based on gender. So a character's performance of masculinity or femininity means something in the performance. So that is for any form of representation. But in musicals, it's even more than that. The architecture of classic musicals, meaning musicals of the 1940s and 50s, the musicals of Rodgers and Hammerstein and Lerner and Loewe, these musicals that came to define the conventions of the form. And these conventions are still ones with which contemporary musical theater artists deal and navigate. Every musical today is dealing with these old conventions, even as it might push against them or stray or do something totally different. But these conventions are really part and parcel of the form. And in the 40s and 50s, one of the key conventions of the form is the heterosexual romance as the narrative structure of the musical. So the very organization of the story is based on a heterosexual coupling and a certain kind of performance of masculinity and femininity. So what gender means is fundamental to the story of most musicals. So that's one thing that's about the story. But then within the form of the musical, that is a form that relies fundamentally on music and singing, one might argue that music is the most important element of the musical, that that's what makes the musical unique, that there are musical numbers that people sing, and musical numbers are one of the key building blocks of the genre. So when we hear different voices, we can hear how those voices are gendered. Even within genders, there are variations of pitch and voice type, but we can typically hear the difference between a male voice and a female voice, although all of this is made more complex by trans and gender blurring binaries, but we'll just suspend our disbelief right now and stick with the idea of binary genders. So these differently gendered voices allow harmony in songs, which is one of the most pleasurable aspects of the musical. And harmony, and especially harmony between, well, I would say especially, but including harmony between a male voice and a female voice, is one of the things that grabs the spectator. And because musical theater relies so much on us being emotionally drawn into the story, the relationships, often by way of music, those gender dynamics are really, really important. I guess the other thing I would say is that so many musicals are actually about a character becoming gendered, especially a woman becoming gendered. And often that gendering, so in other words, a girl becomes a woman, is through heterosexual romance. So we see this in The Sound of Music and South Pacific. We see it in Gypsy, and we actually see it all the way up to Wicked, where the two young women find themselves essentially in their romance with each other. So it's very fundamental to the form. I think because I'm a feminist theater scholar, I'm in the habit of looking at gender first. And I think that other scholars who might come from a different methodological or theoretical perspective might stress other aspects of the form. But for me, it's always first and foremost about gender.
Now, you're talking about this sort of the traditional structure of these classic musicals, how heterosexual romance kind of shapes them and even determines how they work musically. But When you talk about the classic musicals of the 1950s, you point to this interesting convention, the female duet. What's going on there?
Yeah, it's so interesting, and it's something that I noticed the more time I was spending with these classic musicals and these aggressively heterosexual and often misogynist musicals, that in every musical there are a lot of different kinds of songs. So you'll have solo songs, you'll have the various kinds of duets between the lovers, you'll have ensemble numbers, and this creates musical variety, and it also gives the opportunity for different voices to rest for a time. And one of the amazing things about musical theater is that it can use all of these different configurations and groupings of characters to do a lot of work through the music. And many musicals from the mid to late 20th century on, so the 1950s, have this female duet. So one of the things that I noticed was at the end of West Side Story, which is one of the greatest love stories, love musicals of all time, Maria and Anita sing together. They sing A Boy Like That and I Have a Love, a duet that then they unify by the end of the song. And Maria has convinced Anita that love is the most important thing, more important than loyalty to her ethnicity. And this is actually the song that then launches Anita to go to the drugstore, and everything goes from there. And actually it turns Anita to become loyal to Maria through the music. And I call this an example of a pedagogical duet, where one character persuades the other of something else through a song. One woman persuades another. And it's a very intense musical and emotional relationship that happens through the song. So that's one kind of duet that we see, female duet in musicals of the 50s. And another one is what I call the collaborative duet. And an example of this is Sarah and Adelaide in Guys and Dolls. So very near the next last song of the show, they're both bemoaning their fates of being in love with gamblers, and how are they going to ever become the housewives they desire to become, as all women do in musicals in the 1950s. And they decide together that they will marry the man today, as they sing, and change his ways tomorrow. And so this is a song where they build on each other, and the whole song is this call and response. Even though these characters are very different in terms of their performances of femininity, they're answering each other, they're complimenting each other, they're supporting each other, and by the end of the song, they've convinced themselves that they will marry the man today, in spite of his flaws, which they do, and the show ends in a rousing ensemble number of the title number with these two marriages, which somehow by the end of the show seem very unlikely because they're terribly mismatched, as are many couples in musicals. So I think that one of the things that's really interesting to me about these conventions, and specifically about the convention of a female duet, is to look at how it appears in different time periods or in different musicals, and how certain conventions of this form that was in some ways solidified in the 40s, although musicals existed way before then, how these different conventions are used in different ways by different artists through time.
Yes, and speaking of those conventions, there's something that emerges then in the 1960s that you point to, kind of potentially exciting, but also potentially scary, depending on where you fit into society. This phenomenon of the solo female performer.
Right. Yeah. So, it's interesting because many musicals of the 60s still have this heterosexual romance structure, but within many shows, what dominates is a single woman, and some of the greatest musicals of the 60s are that way. So, for example, Hello, Dolly and Mame, two of Jerry Herman's greatest musicals, Cabaret, Sweet Charity, Funny Girl, Oliver, and I might even put Gypsy in that category, which opened in 1959. And all of these musicals really focus on a single woman who is very vibrantly embodied. And in all of these shows, the single woman has a lot of solo numbers, and she does a lot of dancing or moving, or there are big musical numbers built around her, as in Hello, Dolly and Mame, where the whole huge ensemble is dancing around these women. And I connect this phenomenon of the single woman's body and her very present, strong physicality to a figure that emerged in popular culture in the 1960s, that many scholars have labeled the single girl. And this is a figure, a character type who appeared on television in That Girl, embodied by Marlo Thomas, the model Twiggy, the characters in Valley of the Dolls, and also the intended real audience for Helen Gurley Brown's best-selling advice manual, Sex and the Single Girl. And so this was a time when more women were empowered it was after the invention and FDA approval of the birth control pill, and so more women were able to have sex and not be worried about getting pregnant, and Helen Gurley Brown urged young women to have sex and have friends and have a job and get married later. And a lot of these dynamics are reflected in these musicals of the 60s, where single women get a chance to really star in the show, and they get to sing great songs, and they get to do these dances by themselves and are really the focus of the show, which is, from an actor's perspective especially, really fantastic. But what's fascinating about these shows, and what I think illustrates the anxiety about the vibrant single female body on stage, is that many of these characters are pathetic or undermined or very negative stereotypes of women. So in some ways, Sweet Charity is the best example of that. It's a great example. It's a wonderful show. It's a terrible show. It's definitely one of the zillions of shows that any feminist theater scholar, critic, or fan loves to hate and hates to love, which I think is the position that we're in so frequently. So this is a show that punishes the female character and celebrates the actor. So the main character is really pathetic. She just wants to get married. That's really all her entire story is about. She just wants to marry any man. At the beginning and the end of the show, the opening scene and the closing scene, she gets pushed into the lake at Central Park. So it's kind of this abusive, horrifying scene. She seems very naive and idealistic in the show, and maybe even dumb, but it's such a fantastic role. She sings all of these great songs. She does all of these great solos. It's such a meaty role for an actor. And so it's a very conflicted situation, because the ideological work of the show is hateful towards women, but the performance work of the show is very strongly in favor of women. Lee Silverman directed a production last year starring Sutton Foster, and she pushed on the negative stereotypes of the show so beautifully, and she made a production that at once underlined the limited choices for women in the 60s and demonstrated, Sutton Foster's such a smart actor and she's so strong, and gave her a chance to show how this character was not dumb and not too naive and just trying to make her way in a world that was hostile to single women. And it was really a brilliant production, and takes a visionary director like Lee to figure out how to push on a show and still keep it doing what it does.
Now, we've talked about duets, we've talked about solo performers. As we move into the 1970s, you point to the emergence of the ensemble. Think Hair or Godspell. What happens to female characters when we move to this ensemble focus?
Well, in those musicals of the 1970s, the women more become a part of the group. And it's not that their femininity means nothing, but it doesn't tend to mean the one half of a heterosexual narrative that is the key propelling energy of the show. So, for example, in The Wiz, Dorothy has a wonderful part, but The Wiz really functions like an ensemble show. Godspell, there are a variety of women in the cast, and they all perform femininity in different ways, but they're a part of this ensemble. And even in a show like Hair, the Sheila Berger relationship is just one story within a lot of stories that take place in the show. And even the same with A Chorus Line, Cassie and Zach, their long dissolved relationship is touched on in the show and becomes partly the motivation. Well, she wants to get hired, but it becomes part of the motivation for her to sing Music in the Mirror. But that's just within this much larger story of the audition. And even Catherine and Pippin in Pippin, another show from the 1970s, Pippin in the end ends up deciding that he wants to be in this nuclear family, but her story is one piece of his journey through the show. Even Company, which opens in 1970, at kind of the beginning of this period, is more of an ensemble show with Bobby, the male lead, who's in these different scenarios with all of his married friends, and each of the women presents a different image of femininity. So in this time in American history, where there was much more stress on community, where society was negotiating the aftermath of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the women's liberation, there were more musicals that dealt with groups and characters trying to navigate their own identity in relation to a group and community. And so gender is still very important, but it's not so much one half of the straight couple that's driving the story forward.
Now, your book spends a lot of time on Wicked, and Wicked is this, probably for many listeners, one of the most recent examples of the so-called mega musical. Where do female roles fit into the mega musical, for good or for ill?
Well, I wouldn't characterize Wicked as a pure mega musical. That is, a mega musical like Phantom of the Opera or Les Mis, or these musicals that were produced in the late 80s. Most of them came from Britain, and they were excellent to the economy of Broadway, and Phantom of the Opera is still running for reasons that are mysterious to me. No, I think the first 10 times I saw it, I really loved it, and then it just lost its charm. The idea of the mega musical, the term of the mega musical, means big shows and big scores and spectacular effects. And what I argue in the book is that these shows of the late 80s diminished the human form with their excessive scenography, and they even more diminished the female characters and actors. So, for example, in Phantom of the Opera, the character of Christine is just pathetic. The Phantom sings through her, the two men fight over her, and she has barely any choices in her life, either to be a muse or to be a wife. And that's all she gets to do. And when I teach Phantom of the Opera in my classes, my students, who all come into the class loving Phantom, are just appalled when we spend some time on the character of Christine and what she actually does and doesn't get to do in that show. And that's often that's a big love-hate relationship for a lot of my students. And same with Les Mis, which is an incredibly engaging, spectacular, big effects show, and the women in the show do nothing but pine for the men. So this is very sad for women in the 1980s. Even more so in terms of the mega musical, and this, in a moment I'll talk about how different this is from Wicked, is that these mega musicals that are sung through are technically they're locked down, which means once the show starts, once the stage manager says go, they go. And they're almost on a soundtrack like a film. They go, every beat is the same, every note is the same, every bit of blocking is the same. So actors have very little chance to reinterpret a role, give a role their own spin. And the Phantom that you see in New York is meant to be exactly the same one that you see in Paris or London or Japan or Stockholm. With Wicked, this is completely different. Wicked does have the spectacular scenery and all of the flying and amazing effects and smoke and very cool costumes and lights going everywhere and a lot of very cool spectacle, technical aspects that might make someone think it's a mega musical. In that way, it does have the qualities of a mega musical, also with its excessive, exceptionally elaborate marketing machinery and huge marketing for Wicked, still to today, and all through its early days. Even when you couldn't get a ticket for years, it was still advertising as those earlier mega musicals did. But what's so different about Wicked is that it's structured like a classic Rodgers and Hammerstein musical. There are book scenes. So there's a lot of dialogue in Wicked in addition to the songs. And it goes like a classic Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, except for the love story is between two women. So if you put Wicked next to a show like South Pacific or The Sound of Music, you can see how the songs move right along in the same pattern to put Elphaba and Glinda in relationship to each other. So structurally tells a story more like an older musical than like a mega musical. But the other part of this that's enormously important is that the creative artists of Wicked, Stephen Schwartz and Winnie Holtzman, and the producers, David Stone and Mark Platt, want, and from the beginning have wanted, every actor who's played Elphaba and Glinda to put her own spin on the role. There has never been the sense with that show, and still to this day, when actors come into that show, they are not told, do it exactly like the person before you. They're told, yes, of course, you have to sing it in this key, or move here and do this blocking in this basic way for lighting cues and the other things that have to happen. But every character has much more freedom. And so, unlike mega musicals where the woman's role is diminished, in Wicked, the woman's role is expanded and expansive.
Now, with the exception of The Wiz, listeners will probably notice that virtually every one of the musicals that we've talked about, most of these female characters are white. What about the place of women of color in the Broadway musical?
Well, women of color have been in the Broadway musical from the beginning, although seldom in leading roles. And I think it would be fantastic for someone to write another feminist of color history of the musical. And instead of choosing the handful of musicals that I chose, which were big hits and did tend to be white women, I think you could tell a similar story, and I think a super complicated and interesting story about women of color on the musical stage from the 40s and 50s. In the later 90s and 21st century, there have been obviously much more awareness or set noise, or white people finally looking around and being willing to talk about issues of race and racism on the Broadway stage. And there have been more musicals that feature women of color. The 2016 season was a banner year for women of color, with the musical Shuffle Along, or The Making of the Musical Sensation of 1921 and all that followed, which was a great show that closed too soon. And that same year, John Doyle directed a revival of The Color Purple, which was completely brilliant and amazing. And Hamilton, of course, also features women of color. In my book, I look at some musicals a little bit earlier. The character of Lucille in Parade, even though she's a white woman, she's Jewish, and so she is represented in a way in this musical as a woman of color. Her Jewishness renders her different in the show. Of course, The Women in the Color Purple, which was first produced in 2004, and the many amazing female women in The Heights in 2008. So there were just more roles for women at that time who did all kinds of different things. And many of these musicals still obey some of the older conventions. In The Heights is a very traditionally structured show that gives women a ton of great things to do. And they're women of color, which is fantastic. I think that the issue of race on Broadway is a huge issue, and Broadway musicals are much too white on stage and behind the scenes. I am so sorry that Allegiance, for example, which was a cast of Asian American actors, didn't last longer. We have a show like Miss Saigon, which is playing on Broadway now, and it's fantastic because it employs so many Asian and Asian American actors, but it trucks in the worst Asian stereotypes. So I think the struggle is how we can encourage more writers to create musicals that are bankable, because musical theater is commercial, and that also offer non-stereotypical roles for people of color. I mean, Hamilton has in some ways broken that open, but it's still a story about white people played by actors of color. I think I would want to shout out again to Lee Silverman, and also to the director Michael Barras, who directed a fantastic production of The Golden Apple at City Center Encores last season. And it was a completely multiracial cast, and it was so refreshing to go into that theater and see all different kinds of actors on the stage. And I think that we need to have new shows that offer roles to people of color, women of color, men of color. And we also have to have directors and casting directors who will insist on a multiracial cast in everything, no matter what the show is.
Now, speaking of changes, you touched on this issue earlier on in our discussion here, but I'm curious, as we move towards a more nuanced, less sort of rigidly binary view of gender, what do you see changing on the Broadway stage, and in what ways have things perhaps not changed enough?
Right. Well, I think I would say that things have not changed enough yet. And the key issue is that Broadway is a commercial enterprise. Only 20% of Broadway shows make any money. So most investors know that a Broadway show will fail and they'll lose money and it'll be a tax write-off. But everyone wants a Broadway show to succeed and to make money and to run for a long time, or at least launch a successful touring company and amateur productions and all that. And so it tends towards the conservative, even though many artists and even producers are progressive and would probably love to see trans characters or all kinds of shifting genders on stage, genders that we can't even imagine what could happen in the future in terms of performance. In general, I think producers are disinclined to take a chance on something that's really risky. This isn't the place for it, and or it's thought not to be the place for it. And now there are so many nonprofit theaters that are hoping to launch a musical to Broadway, as happened with Fun Home and Hamilton, that I think even some off-Broadway theaters, which might have been incubators for more risky work, are tending possibly not to do that. There's Kinky Boots, which is a big hit, Fun Home, which is now on national tour, which I just think is incredible. The idea of people seeing Fun Home all over the country is amazing. And there's going to be a production in the UK of Sondheim's Company with a female Bobby. But none of these shows really challenge gender as a binary arrangement. I think we've yet to see that, and I really hope that there are some young musical theater composers and lyricists and librettists and directors and producers who will make more of that happen in the future, sooner rather than later.
Stacy, thank you so much for telling us more about the feminist history of Broadway.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much, Mike.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter and Facebook. You can also visit our website at theaterhistorypodcast.net, where you can find links to all of our episodes. And you can email your questions and comments about the show to theaterhistory@theaterhistorypodcast.net. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.